73 seconds. That was all the time between liftoff and silence, between the cheering crowds and the long, bewildered hush that followed, on a cold Florida morning when the sky turned strange and no one could look away. This is a story that has been told many times, though perhaps not like this, not slowly, not with the gentleness that loss eventually asks of us. It is a story of engineers who raised quiet warnings, of ice forming on launchpad towers in the night, of 7 people who climbed aboard a spacecraft because they believed in going. If these slower tellings help the night pass more easily, subscribing means more of them will find their way to you. The air was unusually cold that January morning, frost clinging to the metal scaffolding, and so we begin there. On the morning of January 28th, 1986, the sun rose over the eastern coast of Florida in that particular way it does during winter months, casting a pale golden light across the salt marshes and coastal scrublands that surround the Kennedy Space Center. And, as the darkness lifted from the landscape, it revealed something quite unusual for this subtropical corner of the United States, which was a layer of frost covering the ground, the grasses, the metal structures, and the great launch tower that stood at Launch Complex 39B, where the Space Shuttle Challenger waited in the quiet of early morning, held upright by the embrace of its support structure, its white external tank and twin solid rocket boosters gleaming faintly in the growing light. The overnight temperatures had dropped to approximately 18 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly 8 degrees below zero on the Celsius scale, and this was remarkably cold for central Florida, where citrus groves and warm Atlantic breezes typically keep the winters mild and pleasant, and where hard freezes of this magnitude occur only rarely, perhaps once every several years or even less frequently. And so the cold that had settled over the Space Center during the night was noteworthy, the kind of cold that causes one to see their breath in pale clouds, the kind that makes metal surfaces painful to touch with bare skin, and the kind that transforms ordinary moisture into delicate crystalline structures. Icicles had formed along the launch tower during the night, hanging from railings and walkways and the various pieces of service equipment that surrounded the shuttle. And these formations of ice caught the morning light and glittered there, quite beautiful in their own way, as water that had dripped from pipes and condensed from humid Florida air had frozen in long, thin fingers of ice, some of them several inches in length. And crews had been working through the early morning hours to assess these ice formations and to remove what they could, though the task was considerable given the scale of the launch structure, which rose hundreds of feet into the air and encompassed a vast network of platforms and access ways and fuel lines and electrical conduits. The launch had originally been scheduled for earlier dates, as was often the case with shuttle missions, which frequently experienced delays due to weather, technical considerations, scheduling conflicts with other missions, or any number of the countless factors that must align properly before a spacecraft can safely leave the Earth. And so the crew and the ground teams had been preparing and waiting and preparing again, as is the nature of spaceflight, where patience is not merely a virtue, but an absolute necessity, and where the complexity of the undertaking means that timelines must remain flexible and adaptable to changing circumstances. The scheduled launch time on this particular morning was 9:38 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, and as that hour approached, The 7 crew members who would fly aboard Challenger were completing their final preparations, having been awakened hours earlier to begin the lengthy process of suiting up and conducting final checks and making the journey out to the launch pad, where they would board the orbiter and take their positions in the crew cabin, strapping themselves into their seats and beginning the procedures that would occupy them until the moment of liftoff. The commander of this mission, which was designated STS-51-L in the naming convention used by the Shuttle program, was Francis Richard Scobie, known to his friends and colleagues as Dick, a man of 46 years who had grown up in the state of Washington and who had served as a combat pilot in Vietnam before becoming a test pilot and then an astronaut, and who had flown once before on the Shuttle as pilot of Challenger on a mission in 1984, and who now returned to this same orbiter in the commander's seat, responsible for the overall conduct of the mission and the safety of the crew. Beside him in the pilot's seat was Michael John Smith, 40 years of age, who had grown up in North Carolina and had served as a Navy pilot before being selected as an astronaut, and for whom this mission would be his first spaceflight, though he had trained extensively and had waited many years for this opportunity, as astronauts often do, serving in support roles for other missions while awaiting their turn to fly. Among the mission specialists, those astronauts responsible for conducting the scientific and operational activities of the flight, was Judith Arlene Resnick, a woman of 36 years who held a doctorate in electrical engineering and who had already flown once before on the Shuttle, on the maiden flight of the orbiter Discovery in 1984, making her one of the more experienced members of the crew, and who was known for her intelligence, her competence, and her classical piano playing, which she had studied seriously in her younger years. Also, among the mission specialists was Ellison Shoji Onizuka, 39 years of age, who had grown up in Hawaii, the grandson of Japanese immigrants, and who had become an aerospace engineer and Air Force test pilot before joining the astronaut corps, and who had flown once before on a shuttle mission in 1985, a mission that had been dedicated to Department of Defense activities, and who brought to this crew his quiet professionalism and his deep technical expertise. The third mission specialist was Ronald Irwin McNair, 35 years of age, who had grown up in South Carolina during the era of segregation and who had nonetheless pursued his education with determination and brilliance, eventually earning a doctorate in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specializing in laser physics, and who had flown once before on the Shuttle in 1984, and who was also an accomplished saxophonist who had once considered a career in music before turning to science. The payload specialists, those crew members who are not career astronauts but who fly on specific missions for particular purposes, included Gregory Bruce Jarvis, 41 years of age, an engineer who worked for the Hughes Aircraft Company and who had been assigned to conduct experiments related to fluid dynamics in microgravity, experiments that would have applications for the design of future spacecraft and satellites, and who had waited patiently through several mission reassignments before finally being manifested on this flight. And the seventh member of the crew, the one whose presence on this mission had captured so much of the public's attention, was Sharon Christa McAuliffe, a social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, 37 years of age, who had been selected the previous year as the first participant in the Teacher in Space project, an initiative designed to bring the experience of spaceflight into classrooms across America, and who had been chosen from more than 11,000 teachers who had applied for this remarkable opportunity to fly aboard the Space Shuttle and to conduct lessons from orbit that would be broadcast to students throughout the nation. McAuliffe had submitted her application along with thousands of other educators, writing about her belief that ordinary people should have the chance to experience space and to share that experience with others. And she had progressed through the selection process, through interviews and medical examinations and evaluations, until she had been named the primary candidate, with another teacher named Barbara Morgan selected as her backup up. And she had then spent nearly a year training at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, learning the systems of the shuttle, preparing her lessons, and becoming part of the crew that would fly this mission. The mood on this January morning, despite the unusual cold, was one of anticipation and routine, for this was to be the 25th mission of the Space Shuttle program. And over the 6 years since the first shuttle flight in 1981, the launches had become, if not exactly commonplace, then at least familiar to the American public, part of the regular rhythm of the nation's space activities, reported in the news, but no longer commanding the same breathless attention that had accompanied the early flights of the program or the Apollo missions to the Moon in the previous decade. The Space Shuttle had been designed and promoted as a reusable spacecraft that would make access to orbit routine and economical, flying frequently and reliably. And while the reality of the program had proven more complex and costly than the early projections had suggested, there was nonetheless a sense, by 1986, that shuttle flights were a normal part of American life, that the technology had matured, that the risks, while still present, had been understood and managed, and that spaceflight was entering a new era in which it would become accessible to more and more people, perhaps, eventually, even to ordinary citizens who were not test pilots or scientists or engineers. This sense of normalcy, of spaceflight as an achievable dream rather than an extraordinary feat, was part of what had made the Teacher in Space project so compelling, for it suggested that the frontier of space was opening up, that it would soon be a place where teachers could teach and perhaps where students could learn, where the experiences that had once been reserved for a tiny elite of highly trained aviators and scientists would become available to a broader range of humanity. And so on this cold January morning, crowds had gathered at the Kennedy Space Center to watch the launch in person. Families and tourists and space enthusiasts who had made the journey to this stretch of Florida coastline to witness the spectacle of a shuttle leaving the Earth, to feel the rumble of the engines in their chests, and to watch the bright flame arc across the sky. And they stood in the unusual cold, bundled in jackets and coats that many of them had not expected to need in Florida, stamping their feet and blowing into their hands as they waited for the countdown to reach its conclusion. Across the nation, in classrooms from coast to coast, school children had gathered to watch the launch on television sets that had been wheeled into gymnasiums and cafeterias and individual classrooms. For the presence of Christa McAuliffe on this mission had made it a particular point of interest for educators, who saw in this flight an opportunity to connect their students with the adventure of space exploration, to show them that a teacher, someone not so different from the teachers they knew, could journey beyond the Earth and look down upon it from the void of space. The lessons that McAuliffe had prepared, which she would have delivered from orbit, included demonstrations of how ordinary objects behave differently in the weightlessness of space, how liquids form spheres, and how magnetism and chromatography and other phenomena manifest themselves when freed from the constant pull of gravity. And these lessons would have been broadcast live to students throughout the country, allowing them to participate, in a sense, in the mission, to ask questions and to feel that they were part of this great national endeavor. The countdown proceeded through the morning hours, monitored by the teams in the Launch Control Center and by the Mission Control Center in Houston. And as the clock approached the scheduled launch time, the various systems of the shuttle were brought to their flight-ready states, the crew completing their checklists, the ground teams verifying the status of each subsystem, the range safety officers confirming that the tracking systems were operational, and all the many other activities that must be accomplished before a spacecraft can be committed to flight. There had been discussions during the preceding hours about the cold weather and its potential effects on the vehicle. Conversations that took place in teleconferences between engineers at various locations, as teams considered whether the conditions fell within the acceptable parameters for launch. And these discussions had involved technical assessments and engineering judgments of the sort that are always part of the process of preparing for a launch, though the full nature and significance of these discussions would not become widely known until later. As the final minutes of the countdown elapsed, the crew members sat in their seats in the middeck and flight deck of the orbiter, secured by their harnesses, monitoring their displays, and going through the procedures they had practiced many times in simulators. And they could feel the vehicle swaying slightly in the wind that blew across the launch pad, and they could hear the sounds of the various systems operating around them, the hum of electronics, the rush of fluids through pipes, and the occasional communication from the ground coming through their headsets. The solid rocket boosters and the main engines would ignite in a carefully choreographed sequence, the main engines lighting first and being verified as operating properly before the solid rocket boosters were ignited. For once the solid rocket boosters were lit, they could not be shut down, their solid propellant burning until it was exhausted, and so the vehicle would be committed to flight at that moment, lifting off from the pad and ascending into the sky above Florida. The first 73 seconds of a shuttle flight, from the moment of solid rocket booster ignition until the vehicle cleared the launch tower and climbed through the lower atmosphere, were considered by the program to be a critical phase of the mission, a period during which the stresses on the vehicle were significant and during which certain types of failures would be particularly challenging to manage. And yet, these 73 seconds had been completed successfully on all 24 previous shuttle missions, and there was no particular reason to believe, as the crew and the launch teams went through their final preparations, that this mission would be any different. The morning light continued to strengthen over the Florida coastline, the shadows shortening and the ice beginning to melt in places where the sun reached it directly, though much of the launch structure remained in shadow and the ice there persisted, and the crowds continued to wait, and the schoolchildren continued to watch their television screens, and the crew continued to monitor their displays, and the countdown continued toward zero, and the winter sun shone down upon the launch pad where Challenger waited, ready to begin its 10th flight, ready to carry its 7 crew members into orbit, ready to continue the work of exploring and utilizing the space beyond our atmosphere. The dream of spaceflight, which had seemed so impossibly remote just a few decades earlier, had become real, had become a thing that happened regularly, that could be watched on television, that could be experienced by teachers selected from applications submitted by the thousands. And this normalcy, this sense that humanity had truly begun to extend its reach beyond the planet of its birth, was palpable on this cold January morning, even as the icicles hung from the launch tower and the breath of the spectators formed small clouds in the frigid air. And so the moment approached, the moment when the main engines would ignite and the solid rocket boosters would follow and the hold-down bolts would release and Challenger would rise from the pad, and the crew members sat in their seats, and the launch controllers monitored their consoles, and the spectators watched from the viewing areas, and the schoolchildren watched from their classrooms, and the clocks counted down toward the scheduled launch time of 9:38 in the morning on this 28th day of January in the year 1986. A cold morning in Florida, a morning when spaceflight still seemed routine, when the Shuttle program seemed to be fulfilling its promise of regular access to orbit, when the future of human space exploration seemed bright and expanding and full of possibility. Let us turn now to something quite small, and yet, in the quiet logic of engineering, something that mattered very much indeed. We are speaking of O-rings, which are among the simplest mechanical components one might ever encounter, and yet they performed a task of extraordinary importance within the Space Shuttle system. An O-ring is, at its most fundamental, a loop of rubber, a closed circle of flexible material designed to sit between two surfaces and prevent the passage of gases or fluids from one side to the other. The name itself tells you nearly everything you need to know about its shape, for it is simply a ring, and when you look at its cross-section, you see a circle, the letter O rendered in solid material. There is nothing particularly mysterious about this design, nothing that requires advanced mathematics to understand. It is the sort of thing you might find in a garden hose fitting, or beneath the lid of a preserving jar, or inside the workings of a bathroom tap. And yet, when we speak of the O-rings used in the Space Shuttle's solid rocket boosters, we are speaking of something manufactured to extraordinarily precise specifications, because the consequences of even the smallest failure would be, as you might imagine, quite significant. Each of these particular O-rings measured 37 feet in circumference, which is to say, if you were to cut one and lay it out flat in a straight line, it would stretch a little more than 11 meters, roughly the length of a modest swimming pool. The thickness of each ring, the diameter of its circular cross-section, was precisely 0.28 inches, which is just a little more than 7 millimeters. Picture it, if you will, a loop of dark rubber the width of your smallest finger, large enough to encircle a good-sized room, and yet required to maintain its seal under conditions that would challenge any material known to engineering. These O-rings were manufactured from a substance called Veton fluoroelastomer, which is a synthetic rubber developed specifically for applications requiring resistance to heat, chemicals, and petroleum products. Veton, as a material, possesses many admirable qualities, including its ability to maintain flexibility across a range of temperatures and its resistance to degradation when exposed to harsh substances. It was considered, at the time, an appropriate choice for the demanding environment of rocket propulsion, and in many respects, it performed quite well. To understand why these O-rings mattered so much, we must first understand something about the solid rocket boosters themselves, those tall white cylinders that stood on either side of the space shuttle's external tank, providing the tremendous thrust necessary to lift the entire assembly away from the launch pad during the first 2 minutes of flight. These boosters were manufactured by a company called Morton Tyokol, which operated its primary facility in Brigham City, Utah, a quiet community nestled against the Wasatch Mountains in the northern part of that state. The boosters were enormous structures, each one standing more than 45 meters tall and measuring nearly 4 meters in diameter. When fully loaded with solid propellant, each booster weighed approximately 590,000 kilograms, which is rather a lot to contemplate, though we need not dwell too long on such figures. What matters for our present discussion is that these boosters were far too large to be manufactured and transported as single pieces. The roads and railways between Utah and Florida simply could not accommodate cylinders of such dimension, and so the boosters were built in segments, separate cylindrical sections that would be joined together at the Kennedy Space Center before each launch. Each solid rocket booster consisted of several segments, and these segments were connected by what engineers called field joints, so named because they were assembled in the field rather than at the factory. There were 4 of these field joints per booster, which meant that the complete shuttle system, with its 2 boosters, contained 8 such joints in total. The design of these joints was based on a configuration known as tang and clevis, which is a very old approach to joining cylindrical sections together, used for centuries in the construction of pipes and vessels. In this design, one segment ends in a protruding lip called the tongue, while the adjoining segment features a receiving groove called the clevis. The tongue slides into the clevis, and the 2 pieces are then secured with pins that pass through aligned holes in both components. It is, when you think about it, rather like the way certain pieces of furniture are assembled, or how sections of a telescope might fit together, one piece nesting snugly within another. Within each of these tang and clevis joints sat 2 O-rings, one designated as the primary seal and the other as the secondary, or backup, seal. The primary O-ring was positioned closer to the interior of the booster, nearest to where the burning propellant would generate its tremendous pressure and heat. The secondary O-ring sat just behind it, in the direction of the outside of the booster, serving as a redundant seal in case the primary should fail. This redundancy was an important feature of the design, a recognition that even the most carefully manufactured components might sometimes behave unexpectedly. The theory was straightforward. If the primary O-ring should somehow allow gases to pass, the secondary O-ring would prevent those gases from escaping the joint entirely. Both rings, working together or independently, would keep the tremendous forces of combustion safely contained within the booster casing. And tremendous those forces certainly were. When the solid rocket boosters ignited, the combustion of their propellant generated temperatures approaching 900 degrees Fahrenheit, which is approximately 480 degrees Celsius, hot enough to soften many metals and certainly hot enough to challenge any rubber compound. At the same time, the pressure within the boosters reached approximately 1,000 pounds per square inch, an immense force pressing outward against every surface of the booster casing and, crucially, against the joints where the segments met. The O-rings were required to maintain their seal against both this pressure and this heat, flexing slightly as the joint moved under stress, filling any tiny gaps that might appear as the metal expanded or shifted. This flexing, this ability to respond dynamically to changing conditions, was essential to the O-ring's function. A rigid seal might crack or separate under such stresses, but a flexible seal could accommodate minor movements and continue to do its job. Here, however, we encounter a characteristic of rubber that becomes quite important when we consider the events of January 1986. Rubber, like many materials, changes its behavior as temperature changes. When rubber is warm, it is soft and pliable, able to stretch and compress and spring back to its original shape with ease. But as rubber grows cold, it becomes increasingly stiff, less able to flex, slower to respond to deformation. If you have ever noticed that a rubber band left outside on a winter's night feels hard and brittle, you have observed this phenomenon firsthand. The technical term for this property is resilience, which refers to a material's ability to absorb energy when deformed and then release that energy upon recovery. Warm rubber has high resilience, cold rubber has low resilience. And the Viton fluoroelastomer used in the Shuttle's O-rings, for all its admirable qualities, was not immune to this effect. Below approximately 53 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 12 degrees Celsius, the Viton material began to lose its resilience in a meaningful way. It could no longer flex quickly enough to follow the movements of the joint, could no longer spring back fast enough to fill gaps as they opened. The O-ring would still sit in its groove, would still press against the mating surfaces, but its essential ability to respond dynamically would be compromised. This was not unknown to the engineers at Morton Thiokol, nor was it entirely theoretical. In the years before the Challenger mission, there had been observations, data points really, that suggested something was not quite right with O-ring performance in cold weather. After certain launches, when the solid rocket boosters were recovered from the ocean and examined, engineers found evidence of what they called blow-by, a rather understated term for a rather concerning phenomenon. Blow-by referred to the presence of dark soot and erosion marks on the O-rings and the surrounding metal surfaces. Evidence that hot combustion gases had, at least briefly, pushed past the primary seal before being stopped by the secondary seal or by the primary seal reseating itself. This was not supposed to happen at all, of course, but it had happened on multiple occasions, and the engineers had taken note. One launch in particular stood out in the data. On January 24, 1985, the Space Shuttle Discovery had lifted off on a mission designated STS-51C. The weather that morning in Florida was cold, with temperatures at launch time of approximately 53 degrees Fahrenheit. When the boosters from that mission were later examined, the engineers found significant evidence of blow-by, more than had been observed on any previous flight. The hot gases had penetrated past the primary O-ring and left their characteristic darkening on the surfaces beyond. This was a whisper in the data. If you like, a quiet signal suggesting that cold temperatures and O-ring performance might be related in some meaningful way. The engineers discussed it wrote reports about it, raised concerns in meetings. And yet, the program continued, because rockets are complicated systems and concerns must be weighed against schedules and resources. And because the secondary seal had held, and because the shuttle had flown safely, and because there was always pressure to continue flying, there is something gently melancholy in the way engineering knowledge sometimes accumulates. Observation by observation, flight by flight. Each data point adding to a picture that remains just slightly out of focus until, one day, it becomes terribly clear. The engineers at Morton Thiokol were not negligent people, nor were they unaware of the risks. They were working within a system that generated enormous amounts of information, and they were doing their best to interpret that information and act upon it appropriately. But the relationship between temperature and O-ring resilience, while suspected, had not been fully quantified. The threshold of 53 degrees Fahrenheit was an observation, not a hard engineering limit. And so the shuttle continued to fly, and the O-rings continued to do their work. And the quiet geometry of tang and clevis and rubber ring continued to function. Most of the time, well enough. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the strange intimacy of this engineering problem. Here we have a vehicle capable of carrying human beings to the edge of space, a machine of extraordinary complexity and power, and its safety depended in no small part on loops of rubber sitting in grooves in metal joints, flexing and sealing and recovering their shape thousands of times a second as combustion raged within. The O-rings were not glamorous components, not the sort of thing that would appear on posters or inspire children to dream of becoming astronauts. And yet, without them functioning properly, none of the rest mattered very much at all. This is perhaps the essential lesson of complex systems, that reliability depends not only on the grand architecture, but also on the smallest details, the humble components that do their quiet work out of sight and, hopefully, out of mind. The O-rings of the solid rocket boosters were asked to perform their task perfectly, every time, under conditions of extraordinary stress. And for the most part, they did. But the data from cold weather launches hinted that there might be limits to what could be asked of them, boundaries beyond which even the most carefully designed system might begin to fail. On the night of January 27, 1986, while much of the eastern United States prepared for sleep and the Florida coast lay quiet beneath a cold and starless sky, a small group of engineers and managers gathered around telephones and fax machines in 3 separate locations, connected by the invisible threads of long-distance telephone lines, unaware that the words they would speak and the decisions they would reach in the next several hours would become some of the most carefully examined conversations in the history of American aerospace engineering, studied and restudied for decades to come by people trying to understand how well-intentioned professionals, each doing what they believed was right, could together arrive at a decision that seemed, in the cold light of later analysis, so difficult to explain. The teleconference began in the early evening, around 5:45 in the evening, Utah time, which was 8:45 at night in Florida and 7:45 in Alabama, and it linked together engineers at Morton Thiokol's facility in the remote high desert of northern Utah, where the solid rocket boosters were manufactured, with managers and engineers at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, where those boosters fell under NASA's oversight, and with personnel at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the shuttle itself sat waiting on the launch pad, exposed to the unusual cold that had descended upon the region. A cold front that had brought temperatures far lower than any previously experienced during a shuttle launch. And it was precisely this cold that had prompted the teleconference in the first place, because certain engineers in Utah had been watching the weather forecasts with growing concern. Among those engineers was a man named Roger Boyes-Jolly, who was 47 years old and had spent much of his career thinking about the behavior of rubber and metal under stress, and who had become, in recent months, something of an internal advocate on the subject of the O-rings, those deceptively simple circles of synthetic rubber that served as seals in the joints between the segments of the solid rocket boosters, and who had written internal memoranda warning that the O-rings represented a serious flight safety concern, particularly in cold weather, and who had requested and received permission to form a special task force to address the problem, though that task force had struggled to obtain the resources and attention it needed to make meaningful progress, and who now found himself in a conference room with a small group of colleagues, preparing to present data to NASA that he hoped would convince them to delay the launch until the weather warmed. Alongside Boyes-Jolly was another engineer named Arnold Thompson, who had also been studying the O-ring problem and who shared Boyes-Jolly's concerns. And together with several other Thiokol engineers, they had spent the afternoon assembling charts and data that showed what they believed was a troubling pattern: a correlation between cold temperatures and the erosion and blow-by that had been observed on O-rings recovered from previous shuttle flights. Blow-by being the term used to describe the phenomenon of hot combustion gases escaping past the primary O-ring seal and sometimes reaching the secondary seal. A phenomenon that was never supposed to occur at all, but had been observed on multiple occasions, and erosion being the term for the actual burning away of portions of the O-ring material by those hot gases. And both phenomena were considered serious because they indicated that the seals were not performing as designed. And the engineers believed their data showed that these problems became worse when the ambient temperature at launch was lower. The data they presented included observations from a flight known as STS-51C, which had launched in January of the previous year when the temperature was 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest launch to date, and which had shown the most severe O-ring damage yet observed, with blow-by affecting not just the primary O-ring but reaching the secondary O-ring as well. And the engineers pointed to this flight as evidence that cold temperatures compromise the ability of the O-rings to seal properly, because rubber becomes stiffer and less resilient in cold weather, less able to squeeze into gaps and maintain contact with metal surfaces. And the lower the temperature, the longer it takes for the rubber to respond to pressure and form a seal. And in the fraction of a second after ignition, when the joint rotates slightly due to the immense pressure of combustion, the O-ring must move quickly to follow the metal surface and maintain the seal. And if the rubber is too stiff, too slow to respond, hot gases may escape before the seal is established. Boyes-Jolly and Thompson presented their charts and made their recommendation, which was that the shuttle should not be launched when the temperature of the O-rings was below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, this being the lowest temperature at which they had data. And since the forecast for the following morning predicted temperatures in the low 20s overnight, with a launch time temperature around 36 degrees, well below any previous experience, they argued that proceeding with the launch would be venturing into the unknown, operating outside the qualified range of the hardware, and they recommended waiting for warmer weather. The response from NASA, particularly from managers at Marshall Space Flight Center, was one of surprise and, it seems, some frustration, because this recommendation came very late in the process, on the eve of launch, after years of flying with known O-ring anomalies, and after the agency had come to accept a certain level of O-ring erosion as an allowable condition, and the managers pressed back on the engineering data, questioning whether the correlation between temperature and O-ring damage was truly established, pointing out that some flights with warmer temperatures had also shown erosion, while some cooler flights had not, suggesting that the data was inconclusive. It was during this exchange that one of the NASA managers, a man named Larry Malloy, who served as the Solid Rocket Booster Project Manager at Marshall, expressed his frustration with the Thiokol recommendation in words that would later become among the most frequently quoted of the entire disaster investigation, when he said, in response to the suggestion that they should not launch below 53 degrees, something to the effect of, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April." A statement that conveyed the pressure he felt, the schedule he was trying to maintain, the launches that had already been delayed multiple times, and perhaps also a genuine belief that the engineering data was not sufficient to justify such a dramatic constraint, though the words themselves, when read later with knowledge of what was to come, seemed to carry a weight of impatience that the speakers surely did not intend. Another Marshall manager, George Hardy, expressed his reaction to the Thiokol recommendation by saying that he was appalled by it, though he was careful to add that he would not authorize a launch over the contractor's objection, a statement that placed the decision back in Thiokol's hands, while simultaneously making clear that NASA found the recommendation unacceptable. And this dynamic, of the customer expressing strong displeasure while technically leaving the decision to the contractor, would later be examined as an example of subtle pressure, of how an organization's culture can influence decisions without anyone explicitly ordering a particular outcome. At this point, after approximately 2 hours of teleconference, the Thiokol managers requested a few minutes offline to caucus among themselves, to discuss the situation privately before responding to NASA's concerns. And what followed was perhaps the most consequential private meeting in the history of the American space program, a meeting that took place not in some grand conference room, but in a modest facility in the Utah desert, where a small group of engineers and managers faced each other in the late evening hours, trying to decide what to do. During this offline caucus, which lasted approximately 30 minutes, the senior managers at Thiokol discussed the engineering data and the NASA response, and the engineers, particularly Boyce Jolly and Thompson, continued to argue that the data supported their recommendation, that launching in such cold temperatures was unwise, that they were being asked to prove that it was unsafe to launch rather than being required to prove that it was safe, which represented an inversion of the usual logic of flight safety. But the managers were faced with a difficult situation, a major customer expressing displeasure, a recommendation that seemed to come late and to rely on data that could be interpreted in different ways. and a schedule that had already been disrupted multiple times. It was during this caucus that a senior vice president named Jerry Mason turned to another manager, Bob Lund, who served as Theo Cole's vice president of engineering and who had initially supported the no-launch recommendation, and said to him words that would later be quoted in nearly every account of the disaster, telling him to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat, a phrase that seemed to capture the tension between technical judgment and organizational pressure, between what the data suggested and what the situation demanded. And that would be interpreted by many as a moment when engineering concerns were explicitly subordinated to managerial concerns, though the people involved would later describe the situation in more complicated terms, noting that they believed the data was genuinely ambiguous and that reasonable people could disagree about its interpretation. After the caucus, Theo Cole returned to the teleconference and announced that they had reconsidered their position, that they now recommended proceeding with the launch, and the engineers who had argued against this decision sat in silence, their objections overruled by their management, their concerns noted but not heeded. And Boyce Jolly would later describe this moment as one of the most painful of his professional life, watching the decision move forward despite his warnings, feeling that he had failed to communicate the danger clearly enough. Following the teleconference, Theo Cole was asked to put their launch recommendation in writing and fax it to NASA, which they did, sending a document that stated the temperature data was inconclusive and that the original concerns were not valid enough to prevent launch. And when this fax arrived at Marshall Space Flight Center, those who examined it noted something curious, which was that the signature block at the bottom included the names of managers, but no engineers. The very people who had raised the concerns in the first place had not signed the document recommending launch, their names conspicuously absent from a recommendation that they did not support. The teleconference ended sometime after midnight Eastern Time, and the participants returned to their homes or their hotel rooms or remained at their desks, and the Florida coast lay quiet and cold in the darkness, the shuttle standing white and silent on the launch pad, ice beginning to form on the external tank and on the launch structure, and somewhere in the vast machinery of the space program, a decision had been made, a piece of paper had been signed and faxed, and the countdown continued toward morning. What makes this episode so compelling to those who study organizational behavior and communication is not that villains made evil choices, because there were no villains in this story, only engineers and managers doing what they believed was right under difficult circumstances, but rather that a system designed to ensure safety somehow produced an unsafe outcome, that warnings were raised and discussed and ultimately set aside through a process that followed proper procedures, that the very structures meant to surface concerns and address them instead became channels through which those concerns were diluted and neutralized. And this mystery of how good people in a good organization can together produce a bad decision has occupied researchers for decades and remains relevant far beyond the aerospace industry. The voices that spoke in that teleconference were human voices, tired and stressed and trying to do their jobs, and they carried with them all the limitations of human communication, the difficulty of conveying uncertainty, the challenge of arguing against institutional momentum, the subtle pressures that words like appalled and next April can exert even when no one intends to exert pressure, and the conversation they had was in many ways an ordinary conversation, the kind that happens in organizations every day, full of technical jargon and schedule concerns and competing interpretations of data. And perhaps that is what makes it so unsettling to read the transcripts now. How normal it all sounds, how reasonable each individual statement appears when taken on its own, and how the sum of all those reasonable statements added up to a decision that would prove, in the cold light of the following morning, to be tragically wrong. The night passed slowly in Florida, and the temperature continued to drop, and ice accumulated on the launch structure in quantities that had never been seen before, and the O-rings in the joints of the right solid rocket booster, those simple circles of rubber that had been the subject of so much discussion, grew colder and stiffer in the darkness, waiting for morning, waiting for the moment when they would be asked to perform their function, to seal the joint against the fury of ignition, to hold back the hot gases that would try to escape. And whether they would succeed or fail depended on factors that had been discussed and debated through the night by voices that had now fallen silent, factors that were, in the end, beyond anyone's complete understanding. And so we come now to the 73 seconds themselves. That brief window of time between the moment the solid rocket boosters ignited and the moment when the vehicle came apart in the cold, January sky. We will walk through this timeline together, quite gently, treating each moment as what it was, a sequence of physical events governed by the same laws that govern all things, the expansion of gases, the behavior of materials under stress, the movement of heat from one place to another. There is nothing mysterious here, only the quiet unfolding of cause and effect, the kind of chain reaction that happens whenever energy moves through matter. And if we approach these 73 seconds with patience and care, we can understand them not as something incomprehensible, but as something that follows naturally from everything that came before, from the cold night and the ice and the rubber that had grown too stiff to do its work. At the moment of ignition, designated as T+0 in the mission timeline, the solid rocket boosters came to life in the way they always did, with the rapid combustion of their propellant generating enormous quantities of hot gas that would push against the nozzle and lift the vehicle from the pad. This is a violent process in the purely physical sense, involving temperatures of several thousand degrees and pressures that would be quite difficult to comprehend without some mathematical context. But it is also a process that had been repeated many times before, and the vehicle was designed to contain it. The joints between the segments of the boosters, those tang and clevis connections we discussed earlier, were meant to flex slightly under the pressure and then seal, with the O-rings pressing outward against the metal to create a barrier that the hot gases could not cross. This is what should have happened. And in the left booster, it did happen, the seals performing their function as intended. But in the right solid rocket booster, at the aft field joint, the joint closest to the bottom of the booster, something different occurred. At T plus 0.678 seconds, less than a single second after ignition, cameras positioned around the launch pad captured a phenomenon that would later prove to be of great significance. 8 puffs of dark smoke emerged from the region of that aft field joint, rising briefly into the air before being swept away by the exhaust plume. These puffs were black in color, which told investigators something important about their composition. Black smoke in this context indicates the combustion of the joint's grease and insulation materials, which is to say that hot gases from inside the booster had found a pathway to the outside, had breached the seal that was supposed to contain them. The primary O-ring, stiffened by the cold and unable to move quickly enough into its sealing position, had failed to block the gap, and the secondary O-ring, which existed precisely for moments like this, had also been compromised, in part because the cold had affected it as well, and in part because the putty that was supposed to protect both rings had allowed hot gas to reach them simultaneously. The smoke appeared for approximately 2 seconds and then ceased, which might seem encouraging, but was in fact simply the next phase of a process that was already underway. What happened was this: as the hot gases rushed through the gap in the joint, they carried with them particles of aluminum oxide, a byproduct of the solid propellant's combustion. These particles, along with combustion products from the joint materials themselves, accumulated in the breach and formed a temporary seal, a kind of plug made of ash and oxide that blocked the flow of gas. This is not something that was designed to happen, and it was not something that could be relied upon, but it did happen, and for nearly a minute, the joint appeared to be holding. The vehicle rose from the pad, cleared the tower, and began its ascent through the lower atmosphere, rolling and pitching to achieve its proper trajectory. From the outside, and indeed from the inside, everything seemed to be proceeding normally, but the seal of aluminum oxide was fragile, held in place only by the precise balance of pressures on either side of it. It was not a proper seal, not a designed seal, merely an accidental accumulation of debris that happened to be blocking a hole. And as the vehicle climbed higher and faster, it encountered conditions that would test this improvised barrier in ways it could not withstand. At approximately T+37 seconds, the shuttle passed through a region of maximum aerodynamic pressure, the point in the flight where the combination of speed and atmospheric density creates the greatest stress on the vehicle's structure. This is a normal part of any launch, accounted for in the design, and the vehicle handled it as expected. But the forces were building, and the wind was not as calm as it might have been. At T+58.788 seconds, approximately 1 minute into the flight, a series of high-altitude wind shear events began to affect the vehicle. Wind shear is simply a change in wind speed or direction over a relatively short distance, and it creates additional aerodynamic forces on any object moving through it. The shuttle's flight control system responded to these forces automatically, adjusting the angle of the solid rocket booster nozzles to keep the vehicle on course. These adjustments, called gimbal movements, MOTS, were larger than those seen on any previous shuttle flight, indicating that the wind conditions were more challenging than usual. But the system was designed to handle such variations, and it did handle them, keeping the vehicle stable and on trajectory. What it could not do was prevent those same forces from acting on the aft field joint of the right solid rocket booster, where the temporary seal of aluminum oxide was being subjected to stresses it had never been designed, or rather never been accidentally formed, to withstand. At T+64.660 seconds, the seal failed. A small flame appeared on the right solid rocket booster, emerging from the region of the aft field joint and pointing toward the external tank. This flame was initially quite small, difficult to see against the bright exhaust plumes of the boosters themselves. But it was visible in the enhanced imagery that investigators would later examine frame by frame. The flame indicated that hot gas was once again escaping from inside the booster. And this time, there was no accumulation of debris to block it. The breach in the joint had reopened. Or more precisely, the makeshift seal had been blown away by the aerodynamic forces acting on the vehicle, and the approximately 3,000-degree gases inside the booster now had a direct path to the outside. The flame grew rapidly over the next several seconds, not because the hole was necessarily getting larger at first, but because the escaping gas was impinging on the external tank, heating its surface and beginning to compromise the structure that held the shuttle's liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The external tank was not designed to withstand direct exposure to combustion gases at these temperatures, and the aluminum that formed its outer skin began to weaken. At T plus 66.764 seconds, telemetry data showed the first indication of a pressure change in the right solid rocket booster, suggesting that the breach was now large enough to affect the booster's overall performance. At nearly the same moment, the plume from the breach began to interact with the strut that connected the right booster to the external tank, a structural element that would become important very shortly. From T plus 68 seconds onward, the situation developed with the kind of inevitability that characterizes all physical processes, each event following from the one before, according to the laws of thermodynamics and structural mechanics. The flame from the breached joint had been heating the lower attachment strut between the solid rocket booster and the external tank, weakening the metal until, at T plus 72.284 seconds, the strut failed and the lower portion of the right booster swung outward on its remaining attachment points. This movement brought the nose of the booster into contact with the external tank, specifically with the intertank structure that separated the hydrogen tank in the lower portion from the oxygen tank in the upper portion. Almost simultaneously, the flame that had been playing over the external tank succeeded in breaching the hydrogen tank itself, allowing the super-cold liquid hydrogen to begin escaping. What happened next took place over a span of less than 1 second, between T plus 72.284 and T plus 73.124 seconds. The hydrogen tank at the bottom of the external tank suffered a massive structural failure, and the liquid hydrogen that had been contained inside, approximately 380,000 gallons of it, was suddenly released into the atmosphere. This hydrogen immediately began to mix with the surrounding air and with the oxygen that was also escaping from the failing external tank, and the mixture ignited in what appeared to be a large fireball, but was more accurately described as a rapid combustion event. The external tank essentially came apart, and the aerodynamic forces acting on the shuttle orbiter, which was attached to that tank and traveling at approximately Mach 1.922, or nearly twice the speed of sound, was suddenly and dramatically unbalanced. At an altitude of approximately 48,000 feet, traveling at 1,920 feet per second, the Space Shuttle Challenger experienced what the investigation would later term aerodynamic breakup. This is a somewhat clinical phrase for what happened, but it is also a precise one. The vehicle did not explode in the conventional sense, with a detonation spreading outward from a central point. Rather, The aerodynamic forces acting on its structure, forces that had been balanced and accounted for during normal flight, became impossible to withstand once the external tank was no longer there to provide structural support, and once the trajectory of the vehicle was no longer being controlled. The orbiter broke apart into several large sections, each of which began to tumble through the air, decelerating as they encountered atmospheric resistance. The two solid rocket boosters, their attachment points to the external tank having failed, flew off on their own trajectories, still burning for another 37 seconds until they were destroyed by range safety officers who transmitted destruct commands to prevent them from posing a hazard to populated areas. Among the sections that separated from the vehicle was the crew cabin, which remained largely intact as a structural unit. This is worth noting because it tells us something about the nature of the breakup, namely that it was not a sudden explosive event, but rather a disintegration caused by aerodynamic forces pulling the vehicle apart along its structural joints and attachment points. The crew cabin, being a relatively compact and sturdy structure, survived this initial breakup in a recognizable form. Analysis conducted later would determine that the cabin separated from the forward fuselage section approximately 2 seconds after the vehicle began to break apart, and that it then entered a ballistic trajectory, rising slightly before beginning its descent toward the ocean below. The cabin fell for approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds, carried by its momentum and then pulled downward by gravity, rotating slowly as it descended through the increasingly dense atmosphere. Investigators found evidence suggesting that at least some of the crew members were conscious following the breakup, or at least were conscious long enough to take certain actions. 3 of the personal egress air packs, which were emergency breathing devices stored beneath the crew seats, were found to have been activated. These packs were designed to provide several minutes of breathable air in the event of a cabin depressurization or similar emergency, and their activation required manual manipulation of several switches, actions that could only be performed by a conscious person. It is not possible to know with certainty how long consciousness was maintained, as the breakup would have caused a rapid loss of cabin pressure, and at an altitude of 48,000 feet. The time of useful consciousness without supplemental oxygen is measured in seconds rather than minutes. The cabin struck the surface of the Atlantic Ocean at a velocity of approximately 200 miles per hour, an impact that the structure was not designed to withstand, and that caused immediate and catastrophic damage to both the cabin and its occupants. The impact loads were estimated at approximately 200 times the force of gravity, far beyond the survivable range for any human being. This is a difficult thing to discuss, but it is also a straightforward matter of physics, the conversion of kinetic energy into deformation and heat as the cabin came to rest in the water. The 7 members of the crew, Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe, were not recoverable as intact remains, and the cabin itself was found in fragments scattered across the ocean floor. In the quiet days that followed the loss of Challenger, as the nation moved through its grief and the debris continued to wash upon the shores of the Atlantic, there arose the necessary and solemn task of understanding what had happened. The investigation that would follow was not born of a desire for blame, though blame would eventually find its proper resting places, but rather from the simple and profound need to know what had failed, and why, and how such a failure might never be permitted to occur again. This is the way of careful inquiry, the patient and methodical work of gathering facts and testing hypotheses, and it began formally on the 3rd day of February in the year 1986, when President Ronald Reagan signed an executive order establishing what would come to be known as the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident. The commission was to be chaired by William Rogers, who had served as Secretary of State under President Nixon and who brought to the task a long career in public service and a reputation for thoroughness. Rogers was 72 years old at the time, a man of considerable experience in the workings of government and the complexities of large institutions, and he would guide the commission through its many months of work with a steady and deliberate hand. The task before him and his fellow commissioners was immense in scope, requiring them to examine not only the technical details of the shuttle's systems, but also the decisions and communications that had led to the launch on that cold January morning, and to do so in a manner that would be both rigorous and transparent to the watching public. The members appointed to serve alongside Rogers represented a remarkable gathering of expertise and accomplishment. Among them was Neil Armstrong, the first human being to set foot upon the surface of the moon, who understood perhaps better than anyone the delicate balance of risk and engineering that spaceflight required. Armstrong had walked in a place where no atmosphere existed to carry sound, where the margin between life and death was measured in the thickness of a suit's fabric, and he brought to the commission an intimate knowledge of what it meant to trust one's life to the machines that engineers had built. There was also Sally Ride, who had herself flown aboard the shuttle and who had become the first American woman to travel into space just 3 years earlier. Ride possessed both the scientific training of a physicist and the practical experience of an astronaut, and she would prove to be a quiet but essential presence in the investigation that unfolded. Chuck Yeager, the legendary test pilot who had first broken the sound barrier in the skies over the Mojave Desert nearly 4 decades before, lent his understanding of aircraft and the culture of those who fly them. Yeager had spent his life pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible, and he knew well the ways in which organizations could become accustomed to risk, could begin to accept as normal what had once been recognized as dangerous. And then there was Richard Feynman, a theoretical physicist of extraordinary brilliance who had won the Nobel Prize for his work on quantum electrodynamics and who approached the world with an almost childlike curiosity that belied the depth of his intellect. Feynman was 67 years old and not in the best of health, and he had initially been reluctant to join the commission. But he was persuaded by the importance of the task and by the opportunity to understand something real about the world. These were but a few of the 14 commissioners who would undertake the investigation, and together they represented a breadth of knowledge that spanned the sciences, engineering, law, and public administration. Their work would ultimately encompass the review of more than 12,000 pages of documents, drawn from the files of NASA and its contractors, from internal memoranda and engineering reports and meeting minutes that stretched back years before the accident. They would hear testimony from 160 witnesses over the course of 4 months, listening to engineers and managers and astronauts and administrators, each contributing a piece to the puzzle that the Commission was slowly assembling. It was painstaking work, the kind of work that does not lend itself to dramatic revelation, but rather to the gradual accumulation of understanding, fact by fact and document by document, until the picture becomes clear. The public hearings began in early February and were televised, allowing the American people to witness the process of inquiry as it unfolded. On the 11th of February, just 8 days after the commission had been established, Richard Feynman performed a small experiment that would become one of the most remembered moments of the entire investigation. It was a simple thing, really. The sort of demonstration that a science teacher might conduct in a classroom to illustrate a basic principle. And yet, in its simplicity, lay its power to communicate what more complex analyses had obscured. Feynman had obtained a small piece of the O-ring rubber, the same material used in the joints of the solid rocket boosters, and he had brought with him to the hearing a glass of ice water. The water had been chilled to approximately 32 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly the temperature at which water freezes and not far from the temperature that had prevailed at the launch site on the morning of the accident. During a break in the proceedings, while the cameras continued to broadcast and the other commissioners looked on, Feynman took the piece of rubber and placed it in the ice water, compressing it with a small clamp. He held it there for a time, allowing the cold to penetrate the material, and then he removed the clamp and showed what had happened. The rubber, which at warmer temperatures would have sprung back quickly to its original shape, remained deformed. It had lost its resilience, its ability to recover and seal the gaps it was designed to fill. This was the property called resiliency, and it was essential to the function of the O-rings, for they needed to expand and compress rapidly in response to the pressures and movements of the rocket joints during ignition and flight. At low temperatures, the rubber became stiff and slow, unable to respond quickly enough to maintain the seal, and this was what had allowed the hot gases to escape on that January morning. Feynman, with his glass of ice water and his piece of rubber, had shown in a matter of seconds what volumes of technical reports had failed to make clear to those who had made the decision to launch. The demonstration was not the result of sudden inspiration, but rather of careful preparation and the assistance of others who understood where the investigation should focus. Among those who helped guide Feynman toward the O-rings was Sally Ride, who had been examining the evidence with the quiet intensity that characterized her approach to all things. Ride had come across documentation that highlighted the concerns engineers had raised about the performance of the O-rings at low temperatures, and she had passed this information along to Feynman in the days before the hearing. It was a small gesture, the sharing of a report between two scientists who understood the importance of following the evidence wherever it might lead, and yet it proved to be of considerable significance. Ride did not seek attention for her role in this, preferring to work methodically and without fanfare, and it was only later that her contribution to this crucial moment became more widely known. Feynman himself was not content to participate only in the public hearings and the formal processes of the Commission. He undertook his own inquiries, visiting NASA facilities and speaking directly with the engineers who had worked on the shuttle systems, asking questions in his characteristic manner and probing for the truth beneath the layers of bureaucracy and institutional reluctance. He found that the concerns about the O-rings had been raised repeatedly in the years before the accident, that engineers had documented the erosion and damage observed in previous flights, and that these warnings had somehow failed to reach the decision-makers in a form they could act upon. The information had been present in the system, contained in reports and memoranda and briefings, and yet the system had processed this information in ways that diluted its urgency and allowed the flights to continue. This was perhaps the most troubling discovery of the investigation. Not that a technical failure had occurred, for technical failures can happen in any complex system, but that the warning signs had been visible and had not been heeded. The organizational culture of NASA, which had once been characterized by a rigorous attention to safety and a willingness to delay launches until every concern had been addressed, had evolved in ways that made it more accepting of anomalies and more susceptible to the pressures of schedule and politics. The O-ring erosion had been observed before and had not caused a catastrophe, and so it came to be regarded as an acceptable risk, a known deviation that could be tolerated rather than a warning that demanded corrective action. Feynman was deeply troubled by this finding, and he expressed his concerns in an appendix to the Commission's final report, a personal statement that he insisted be included despite some resistance from those who felt it might be too critical. In this appendix, he wrote of the gap he had observed between the assessments of the engineers and the assurances of the managers, noting that NASA management had placed the probability of failure at 1 in 100,000, while the engineers' own estimates suggested the risk was closer to 1 in 100. This was a difference of 3 orders of magnitude, a 1,000-fold discrepancy that revealed how thoroughly the institution had lost touch with the reality of its own systems. The appendix concluded with a statement that has since been quoted many times, a simple observation that contained within it a profound truth about the relationship between human institutions and the physical world they seek to master. Feynman wrote that for a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. It was a gentle admonition, delivered without rancor, but with the weight of hard-won understanding, and it spoke to the heart of what had gone wrong. The shuttle had not failed because the laws of physics had changed, or because some unforeseeable event had occurred. It had failed because the cold had made the rubber stiff, a simple and predictable consequence that had been documented and discussed and then somehow set aside in the complex machinery of decisions that led to launch. The Commission continued its work through the spring of 1986, gathering testimony and reviewing evidence and preparing its findings. The final report, delivered on the 9th of June, would span multiple volumes and contain detailed technical analyses alongside recommendations for changes to NASA's management and decision-making processes. It would describe the physical cause of the accident, the failure of the O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster, and it would also describe the organizational causes, the failures of communication and judgment that had allowed a known vulnerability to become a fatal flaw. But on that February day, when Feynman held up his piece of rubber and showed how it had lost its springiness in the cold water, something important had been accomplished that went beyond the technical findings. The investigation had shown that complex problems could sometimes be illuminated by simple experiments, that the truth could be made visible in ways that anyone could understand. The detective work had begun, and it would proceed with patience and care, one fact at a time, until the full picture emerged from the thousands of pages and the hundreds of testimonies, until the lessons could be drawn and the reforms could be proposed, until the memory of those lost could be honored by the commitment to do better in the flights that were yet to come. And so we come now to something rather like an archaeological excavation, where we must carefully brush away the sediment of time to reveal what lies beneath, layer upon layer of warnings and memoranda and quiet concerns that accumulated over many years before that cold January morning. It is a patient sort of work, this looking backward, and we shall take our time with it, turning over each fragment with the care it deserves. For there is much to learn in these buried signals, these voices that spoke and wrote and cautioned long before the world was watching. If we begin at the deepest stratum, the oldest layer of this particular dig, we find ourselves in the year 1977, nearly a full decade before the Challenger lifted off from its pad. The space shuttle had not yet flown, was still being assembled and tested and dreamed about, and engineers were doing what engineers do, which is to examine every joint and seal and fastener with a kind of loving suspicion, turning problems over in their minds the way one might turn a smooth stone in one's pocket. Among these engineers was a man named Leon Ray, who worked for the Marshall Space Flight Center, and who had noticed something troubling about the way the field joints in the solid rocket boosters behaved under pressure. What Leon Ray observed, and what he carefully documented in his reports, was that when the boosters were pressurized, the tang and clevis sections of the joint would rotate slightly, would flex and move in ways that had not been entirely anticipated. This rotation, small as it was, had consequences for the O-rings that were meant to seal the joint, for as the metal moved, the gap that the O-rings were meant to fill would widen, would open up at precisely the moment when the seal was most needed. It was a subtle thing, this joint rotation problem, the sort of detail that might easily be lost in the vast complexity of a spacecraft. But Leon Ray saw it and recorded it and passed it along to those who he hoped might act upon it. And here we encounter our first lesson in the archaeology of warnings, which is that a warning recorded is not necessarily a warning heeded. The joint rotation problem was noted, was discussed, was added to the long list of concerns that engineers carried with them, but it did not stop the work from proceeding, did not halt the schedule that was moving steadily toward the shuttle's first flight in 1981. There were reasons for this, as there always are, reasons that seemed sensible at the time, and we shall not judge too harshly from our comfortable distance, for we were not there in those rooms, were not privy to the calculations and the compromises that every large endeavor requires. Let us move up through the layers now, ascending through time to the year 1985, where we find another voice speaking into the institutional silence, another engineer whose concerns were committed to paper in the hope that paper might carry weight where words alone had not. This was Roger Boisjoli, whom we have met before, and in July of that year he wrote a memorandum to his superiors at Morton Thiokol that used language one does not often find in engineering documents, language that was stark and unambiguous and almost desperate in its urgency. In this memorandum, Boisjoli wrote of the O-ring erosion that had been observed on previous flights, of the growing evidence that something was not right with the way these seals were performing, and he warned that if the problem were not addressed, the result would be what he called a catastrophe of the highest order, involving the loss of human life. These were not words chosen lightly, were not the usual hedged and qualified language of technical reports, and Boyce Jolly knew this, understood that he was putting himself forward in a way that might not be welcome, might mark him as an alarmist or a troublemaker in an organization that prized smooth operations and team players. The memorandum was received, was read, was filed in the appropriate folders, and the work continued. There were meetings about the O-ring problem, task forces assembled, and reports generated. But the flights did not stop. The schedule did not pause. And with each successful mission, the urgency seemed to diminish slightly, like a sound growing fainter as it travels through distance. This is the nature of warnings in large organizations, that they must compete with 1,000 other priorities, must fight for attention against the daily press of business, and often they are simply absorbed into the general background noise, heard but not truly listened to. Here we must pause to consider a concept that helps us understand how such things happen, a term coined by a sociologist named Diane Vaughan, who spent many years studying the Challenger disaster and who published her findings in 1996 in a book called The Challenger Launch Decision. The term she developed was normalization of deviance, and it describes a process so gradual, so incremental, that those caught within it rarely notice it happening at all, much as a person standing on a glacier might not perceive the slow movement of the ice beneath their feet. What Vaughan observed in her research was that the engineers and managers at NASA and Thiokol were not reckless people, were not indifferent to safety or cavalier about human life. They were, for the most part, careful and conscientious professionals who believed they were making reasonable decisions based on the evidence available to them. But the evidence, as it accumulated over many flights, began to tell a story that was easy to misread, a story that seemed to suggest that the system was more robust than it actually was. The way this worked was something like this. On an early flight, some erosion of the O-rings would be observed after the solid rocket boosters were recovered from the ocean. This erosion was not supposed to happen, was outside the design specifications, and it was noted and discussed and analyzed. But the flight had been successful, the crew had returned safely, and so the erosion was accepted as a manageable anomaly, something to be monitored but not something that required immediate action. And then on the next flight, perhaps a bit more erosion was observed. But again, the flight was successful, and so this too was absorbed into the expanding envelope of acceptable risk. With each flight, the boundary of what was considered normal shifted slightly outward, accommodating deviations that would once have been alarming, treating them as evidence that the system could tolerate such conditions rather than as warnings that the system was operating outside its intended parameters. The very fact that nothing catastrophic had happened became, in a strange inversion of logic, proof that nothing catastrophic would happen, that the engineers who worried about these things were perhaps being overly cautious. The absence of disaster was mistaken for the presence of safety. This is the normalization of deviance, this slow drift toward accepting the unacceptable, and it is not unique to NASA or to aerospace engineering. It happens in hospitals and factories and financial institutions, anywhere that complex systems are operated by human beings who must make judgments under uncertainty. It is not malice and it is not stupidity. It is simply the way that minds and organizations adapt to circumstances, finding comfort in patterns even when those patterns are pointing toward catastrophe. Let us move upward through our archaeological layers once more, to a briefing that took place in 1985, where the solid rocket booster joints were formally classified according to NASA's system for categorizing potential failures. The designation assigned to the joints was Criticality 1, which in NASA's terminology meant that this was a single-point failure mode with no backup, no redundancy, no second chance if something went wrong. A criticality. One item is one whose failure would result in loss of mission and loss of crew, a component so essential that it must work correctly every single time without exception. This classification should have been, one might think, a source of considerable concern, a flag planted firmly in the ground that said, "Here is something that must not fail." But the classification existed alongside the accumulating evidence of erosion and blow-by, alongside the memoranda from engineers like Boyce-Jolly, and it was absorbed into the same framework of normalized deviance that had come to govern thinking about the boosters. The joints were Criticality 1. Yes, but they had not failed yet. Had they? And the flights continued to succeed, and the pressure to maintain the schedule did not diminish. The schedule. Here is another layer in our excavation, another stratum that must be examined with care. By 1986, the Space Shuttle had been flying for nearly 5 years, and it had undergone a subtle but significant transformation in the way it was perceived and managed. In its early years, it had been treated as what it was, an experimental vehicle, a new and untested technology that required careful handling and conservative decision-making. But as the flights accumulated and the public grew accustomed to watching shuttles rise into the sky and return safely to Earth, the program began to be spoken of in different terms, was described as operational rather than experimental, as if it were an airliner rather than a spacecraft. This shift in language reflected a shift in expectations. An operational vehicle is one that runs on a schedule, that meets its commitments, that can be relied upon to perform as promised. And the commitments made for 1986 were ambitious indeed, with 24 flights planned for that single year. A rate of launches that would require everything to run smoothly, would leave little room for delays or postponements, or the sort of caution that had characterized the earlier years of the program. The pressure to fly was not imagined or invented. It was real, and it was felt throughout the organization, shaping decisions in ways both obvious and subtle. We can see, now, how these layers accumulated one upon another, how the earliest warnings were buried beneath subsequent flights and schedule pressures and the slow creep of normalized deviance. Leon Ray's observations about joint rotation in 1977 became part of the sediment, covered over by years of flights that seemed to confirm that the problem was manageable. Roger Boyce-Jolly's memorandum predicting catastrophe was filed and noted but not acted upon with the urgency it deserved, because urgency was in short supply when there were missions to fly and customers to satisfy. The Criticality 1 classification became just another piece of paperwork, its stark warning diluted by the comfortable assumption that what had worked before would work again. This is what an archaeology of warnings reveals. Not a single smoking gun or a clear moment of negligence, but rather a complex stratigraphy of small decisions and missed opportunities, each layer making the next one more likely, each accommodation of risk making the final catastrophe more probable. The people making these decisions were not villains, were not consciously choosing danger over safety. They were simply human beings doing their best within a system that had developed its own momentum, its own logic, its own ways of seeing and not seeing. Diane Vaughan, in her careful reconstruction of these events, was at pains to make this point, to resist the temptation to find simple answers where only complex ones would do. The normalization of deviance was not a failure of individual character, but a property of the system itself, emerging from the interaction of technical uncertainty and organizational culture and institutional pressures. Understanding this does not excuse what happened, does not absolve anyone of responsibility, but it does help us see how such things can happen even among well-intentioned people, even in organizations that genuinely believe they are putting safety first. And so we leave these buried warnings for now, these voices that spoke and wrote and cautioned, knowing that they were not heard in the way they needed to be heard, that the layers of sediment continued to accumulate until that cold morning in January when the ground finally gave way. There is more to this story, more layers to examine and more lessons to draw. But for now, let us simply sit with what we have uncovered. Let our eyes adjust to the dim light of the past and breathe slowly as we consider how complex systems fail. Not all at once, but gradually, one small accommodation at a time, until the thing that everyone said would never happen becomes the thing that could not have happened any other way. In the days and weeks that followed the loss of Challenger, there came a quiet that settled over the Kennedy Space Center, a stillness that would stretch outward across months and eventually years, as the work of understanding began in earnest. The Space Shuttle program entered what would become the longest stand-down in its history, a pause of 32 months during which no shuttle would leave the launch pad. No solid rocket boosters would ignite against the Florida sky, and the entire architecture of how NASA approached human spaceflight would be carefully, methodically, and thoroughly reconsidered. This was not a pause born of defeat, though grief was certainly present in every corridor and conference room. It was rather a pause born of the understanding that the path forward required building something stronger from the foundations up, that the lessons written in loss demanded to be learned completely before any crew could again be asked to trust their lives to the system that had failed. The redesign of the solid rocket booster joint began almost immediately, and the engineers who undertook this work approached it with a kind of reverent attention to detail that transformed technical drawing into something approaching devotion. The original tang and clevis joint, which had allowed hot gases to escape through gaps that widened under pressure and cold, was fundamentally reimagined. The new design incorporated what came to be known as a capture feature, an additional lip of metal that would prevent the tang from rotating away from the clevis even under the most extreme conditions of pressure and temperature variation. Where the original joint had relied on the pressure of combustion gases to seat the O-rings properly, a phenomenon that had proven tragically unreliable, the new joint was designed to maintain its seal regardless of internal pressures, holding firm through its own mechanical geometry rather than depending on forces that could not always be predicted. The O-ring system itself was expanded and reconceived. Where the original design had employed 2 O-rings, a primary and a secondary, the new configuration incorporated 3, adding an additional layer of redundancy that acknowledged the fundamental truth that seals can fail, that rubber can lose its resilience, and that systems designed to protect human life must account for the possibility of imperfection. These new O-rings were made from a different compound, one selected specifically for its ability to maintain flexibility across a wider range of temperatures, and they were seated in redesigned grooves that allowed for more reliable contact with the metal surfaces they were meant to protect. But the engineers understood that even the most carefully designed seal would struggle against the cold, and so they added heater systems to the field joints, electrical elements that could warm the critical areas before launch to ensure that the O-rings would be supple and responsive when called upon to do their essential work. These heaters represented a kind of admission, an acknowledgement that the Florida climate could not always be trusted to provide conditions favorable to flight, and that technology must sometimes compensate for the unpredictable nature of the world in which it operates. Perhaps most significantly, NASA established firm weather constraints that had not existed before. Requirements written into launch commit criteria that could not be waived or rationalized away. The new rules specified that no shuttle would launch if the temperature of the solid rocket booster, O-rings, was below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, a threshold derived directly from the data that had been available before Challenger but had not been properly understood or heeded. This number, 40 degrees, became a kind of memorial in itself, a permanent reminder that the laws of physics do not negotiate, that the behavior of materials under stress follows predictable patterns that must be respected rather than dismissed. The physical redesigns, however, represented only one dimension of the changes that emerged from those 32 months of reflection. The Presidential Commission that investigated the disaster had identified problems not just in hardware, but in the way information flowed through the organization, in the culture that had allowed concerns raised by engineers to be filtered and diminished as they traveled up the chain of command. To address these deeper structural issues, NASA created the Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance, a new organization with a mandate to serve as an independent voice within the agency, answerable not to program managers or center directors, but directly to the NASA administrator. This office was designed to ensure that safety concerns could reach the highest levels of decision-making without being softened or subordinated to schedule pressures, that the engineers closest to the hardware would have a clear path to make their voices heard when they saw something that worried them. The creation of this office represented an understanding that organizational culture can be as much a cause of accidents as faulty equipment, that the way people talk to each other and listen to each other within an institution shapes what that institution is capable of seeing and responding to. It was an attempt to build into the structure of NASA itself a kind of permanent skepticism, a role whose entire purpose was to ask uncomfortable questions and to resist the natural human tendency to minimize problems in the service of keeping things moving forward. While the engineers redesigned joints and the administrators restructured organizations, the families of the Challenger crew were engaged in their own work of transformation, a process that would eventually touch millions of lives in ways both intimate and expansive. In 1986, just months after the loss, the families came together to establish the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, an organization built on the conviction that the best way to honor those who had been lost was to continue the educational mission that had brought Christa McAuliffe to the crew in the first place. The center was not a monument in the traditional sense, not a static memorial to be visited and contemplated, but rather a living institution dedicated to inspiring in young people the same curiosity about space and science that had defined the lives of the 7 crew members. The first Challenger Learning Center opened in Houston in 1988, offering students the opportunity to participate in simulated space missions, to work together in teams solving problems and making decisions in environments designed to capture something of the challenge and excitement of actual spaceflight. The concept proved compelling, and additional centers began to open across the United States and eventually around the world. Today, there are more than 40 of these learning centers operating on multiple continents, each one a place where children can experience the wonder of exploration and perhaps begin to imagine themselves as future scientists, engineers, or astronauts. The centers have served millions of students over the decades, an ongoing legacy that continues to grow and evolve, touching new generations who were not yet born when Challenger was lost, but who benefit nonetheless from the dedication and vision of the families who chose creation over despair. At the Kennedy Space Center itself, a different kind of memorial took shape. One designed to honor not just the Challenger crew, but all astronauts who have given their lives in the pursuit of space exploration. The Astronaut Memorial, completed in 1991, is a remarkable piece of architecture, a massive granite wall standing more than 40 feet high and 50 feet wide. Its polished surface bearing the names of those who have died in service to the American space program. The names are cut entirely through the stone, so that sunlight passes through from behind and illuminates each letter from within, making them glow against the dark background of the granite. A mechanical system tracks the movement of the sun throughout the day, adjusting mirrors to ensure that the names remain bright and readable regardless of the sun's position in the sky. The memorial is often called the Space Mirror, a name that captures something of its ethereal quality. The way it seems to project the names of the fallen outward into the heavens rather than simply recording them on earthbound stone. Visitors who stand before it often speak of the surprising emotional impact of seeing those names illuminated from within, of the way the design transforms a list of the dead into something that seems almost alive, present, reaching toward the sky that was both their calling and their place of departure. The names of the Challenger crew are there, joined now by others who have followed them, and the memorial has room for more names than it currently holds. An acknowledgement that the work of exploration continues and that the risks inherent in that work have not been eliminated, only managed and accepted with clear eyes and careful preparation. In the years that followed the disaster, the music of Ronald McNair continued to resonate in spaces he never had the chance to visit in life. McNair had been an accomplished saxophonist, a man whose love of music existed alongside his love of science, and before the Challenger mission, he had planned to record a piece while in orbit, a saxophone performance that would become the first musical recording made in space. When he died before he could realize this dream, the dream itself was not forgotten. In 2011, A recording of McNair playing Amazing Grace on his saxophone was played aboard the International Space Station. The melody drifting through the modules where astronauts from many nations lived and worked. A tribute that finally brought his music to the realm of space, even though he himself could not make the journey. The recording was played as part of a commemoration of the anniversary of the disaster, a moment of remembrance that allowed his artistry to complete, in a sense, the voyage that had been interrupted. On the evening of the disaster, President Ronald Reagan had been scheduled to deliver the State of the Union address. But that speech was postponed, and instead, the president addressed the nation from the Oval Office, speaking directly to a country that was struggling to understand what had happened and what it meant. In that address, crafted with the help of speechwriter Peggy Noonan, Reagan acknowledged the grief that had descended upon the nation and sought to place the loss within a larger framework of meaning and purpose. He spoke of the crew as pioneers, as people who had understood the risks they faced and had chosen to face them anyway because they believed in the value of what they were doing. Near the end of the speech, he turned to words written decades earlier by a young pilot named John Gillespie McGee, a 19-year-old American who flew Spitfires for the Royal Canadian Air Force during the Second World War and who had died in a training accident over England in 1941. McGee had written a sonnet called High Flight, a poem that captured the transcendent joy of aviation in language that has resonated with pilots and space travelers ever since. Reagan quoted the final lines of that poem, saying that the Challenger crew had slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. The phrase entered immediately into the collective memory of the nation, becoming the words most closely associated with the disaster and with the way Americans chose to remember and honor those who were lost. It was language that elevated technical failure into something approaching the sacred, that transformed an engineering tragedy into a spiritual departure, and that allowed a grieving nation to find some measure of consolation in the idea that the crew had achieved, in their final moments, a kind of ultimate freedom. The phrase has been quoted countless times in the decades since, at memorial services and graduation ceremonies, in books and documentaries. Whenever people seek words adequate to the experience of those who venture beyond the atmosphere that has sheltered human life since its beginning. It has become part of the liturgy of spaceflight, a way of speaking about loss that acknowledges both the grief and the grandeur, that refuses to reduce the deaths to mere accident or failure, and instead insists on seeing in them something meaningful and even beautiful. This transformation of tragedy into meaning, of engineering failure into occasion for growth and remembrance, represents perhaps the most important work that emerged from the 32 months of the stand-down and from all the years that have followed. The redesigned joints and the new O-rings, the heater systems and the temperature constraints, the Office of Safety and the Challenger Centers and the Space Mirror. All of these are expressions of a single underlying commitment, the determination to ensure that those who died would not have died for nothing, that their loss would be answered with learning and their absence filled with ongoing effort toward the goals they had pursued. And now, if you will, let us gently widen our view, stepping back from the particulars of that cold January morning, back from the documents and the testimonies and the careful engineering analyses, and allow ourselves to consider the larger stillness that surrounds all human endeavor, the quiet that exists between our questions and whatever answers the universe might eventually provide. For there is a perspective available to us. If we choose to take it, that does not diminish the loss or smooth away the grief, but rather places it within a context so vast that even our deepest sorrows become part of something luminous and ongoing, something that continues to unfold across distances and timescales that dwarf our individual lives, while somehow making each of those lives more precious, not less. In the years following the loss of Challenger, astronomers at the Palomar Observatory in California continued their patient work of cataloging the solar system, turning their instruments toward the darkness between the planets and recording the slow movements of countless small bodies that drift through that immense emptiness. And in the course of this work, as happens when human beings are given the privilege of naming newly discovered objects, 7 asteroids were designated to carry the names of the 7 crew members who had been lost. Asteroid 3350, SCOBY, now travels its elongated path around the Sun, as does 3351 Smith, 3352 McAuliffe, 3353 Jarvis, 3354 McNair, 3355 Onizuka, and 3356 Resnick. Each of these small worlds no more than a few kilometers across, dark and silent and impossibly remote, yet bearing names that once belonged to people who laughed and worried about small things and felt nervous before important moments and loved others and were loved in return. These asteroids were not placed there by human hands, of course, for we have not yet developed the capability to move such objects or to inscribe them with our intentions. They were simply given names, which is one of the oldest and most persistent things that human beings do, this naming of the world around us. This insistence that the universe acknowledge our presence even when we are such small and temporary creatures within it. And yet, there is something fitting about these designations, something that feels neither grandiose nor insufficient, because an asteroid is a humble sort of memorial, a piece of rock and metal that formed billions of years ago from the same cloud of dust and gas that eventually became our Sun and our Earth and ourselves, and which will continue to exist long after every monument we might build has crumbled into forgetting. The orbital periods of these asteroids vary somewhat, but most of them complete one journey around the Sun in approximately 3 to 4 Earth years, which means that since the Challenger disaster, each of these small worlds has made its circuit dozens of times, passing through the same regions of space again and again in that patient repetition that characterizes so much of celestial mechanics. They do not know that they carry these names, of course, for knowing is not something that rocks do. But we know, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the meaning we attach to things is the only meaning there is, and perhaps that is not a diminishment, but rather a gift. The gift of being the kind of creatures who can look up at the night sky and feel connected to points of light that are impossibly far away. There is also, on the surface of the Moon, a crater that bears the name McNair, honoring Ronald McNair, who was one of the first African-American astronauts and who had already flown one mission aboard Challenger before his final flight. The Moon is closer to us than the asteroids, close enough that we have walked upon it and left footprints that will remain visible for millions of years in the absence of wind or rain to erase them. And the naming of lunar features has a long history that stretches back centuries to when astronomers first began mapping that familiar yet alien landscape. The McNair crater is small, as lunar craters go, but it is there, a permanent feature of a world that we can see with our unaided eyes on clear nights. And whenever the moon rises over any part of the Earth, that name rises with it, carried aloft by the slow rotation of our planet beneath the unchanging stars. These memorials exist at such different scales from our everyday experience that they can be difficult to hold in the mind. And perhaps that is appropriate, because grief itself operates at scales that shift and change, sometimes feeling as immediate and overwhelming as a physical presence, and at other times receding to something more like a distant ache, a awareness of absence that colors the world without dominating it. The asteroid 3352 McAuliffe, for instance, is at this moment somewhere in its orbit, either approaching the Sun or receding from it, either closer to the Earth or farther away, and this fact is simultaneously meaningless and profound, a piece of trivia and a cosmic truth, depending on how we choose to receive it. Let us also consider the Space Shuttle program as a whole, because Challenger was not an isolated endeavor, but rather part of something larger, a sustained effort to make access to space more routine and more practical. And this program continued after the disaster, learning from what had gone wrong and implementing changes that reflected that learning. In total, the Space Shuttle program flew 135 missions over the course of 30 years. From the first flight of Columbia in April of 1981 to the final flight of Atlantis in July of 2011. 355 individual astronauts flew aboard these vehicles, some of them making multiple flights. And together, they accumulated more than 1,500 days of cumulative spaceflight experience. Enough time that if it were continuous, it would span more than 4 years of living and working in orbit. These missions accomplished a great many things that it would take a very long time to enumerate fully. But among them was the construction of the International Space Station, which remains in orbit to this day and which represents perhaps the most ambitious international construction project in human history, a collaboration among 16 nations that resulted in a habitable structure the size of a football field, assembled piece by piece over the course of more than a decade. Astronauts and cosmonauts have lived aboard this station continuously since November of the year 2000, which means that for more than 2 decades now, there have always been human beings living off the surface of the Earth, a fact so remarkable that we sometimes forget to be astonished by it. The lessons learned from Challenger were woven into this ongoing project, not as a correction of past mistakes only, but as part of a broader commitment to understanding the risks of spaceflight and managing them as thoughtfully as possible. This did not make spaceflight safe, because spaceflight has not yet become safe and may never become safe in the way that, say, commercial airline travel has become safe. But it did make the program more honest about the risks it was asking people to accept, and more rigorous about the processes by which decisions were made. The Rogers Commission's recommendations were implemented. The O-ring design was modified. Communication practices were reformed, and the culture of the organization shifted, gradually and imperfectly, but genuinely, towards something more open to dissenting voices and more willing to acknowledge uncertainty. And now, if I may, I would like to tell you about a place that very few people will ever see. A place that exists beneath the surface of the earth rather than above it, and which serves as a quiet memorial to those who were lost. At Cape Canaveral, on the same stretch of Florida coastline where so many rockets have launched and where the Challenger lifted off on that January morning, there is an abandoned Minuteman missile silo, a relic of an earlier era when the same engineering skills that would later send people into space were being applied to the construction of weapons capable of ending civilization itself. This silo has been repurposed, if that is the right word, to serve as the final resting place for the recovered crew cabin of Challenger, which was brought up from the ocean floor in those difficult weeks after the disaster. The cabin was not intact, of course, and the remains of the crew members were returned to their families for burial according to their wishes. But the structure itself, what was left of it, was placed in this silo and sealed with concrete, buried beneath the Florida soil in a location that is not marked by any public monument or sign. This was a deliberate choice, a decision to create a memorial that exists without announcing itself, that does not invite visitors or commemorate the loss in any conventional way, but simply holds the physical remnants of the spacecraft in a kind of permanent safekeeping, protected from weather and time and the curiosity of those who might wish to see. There is something both comforting and melancholy about this arrangement. This idea of the crew cabin resting in the darkness beneath the same landscape where their journey began, sealed away from the world, but not forgotten, known about but not visited, acknowledged but not displayed. It is, in its way, a very human solution to an impossible problem, the problem of what to do with the physical remains of a tragedy that was also a triumph of courage and aspiration. The problem of how to honor the dead without turning their deaths into a spectacle. And so we arrive, at last, at the widest possible perspective, the cosmic view that astronomers and poets have always shared, the recognition that we are very small creatures living on a very small planet in a very large universe, and that everything we do, every launch and every landing, every success and every failure, every act of courage and every moment of grief, takes place against a backdrop of such immense scale and duration that it ought to make our efforts seem insignificant, and yet, somehow, does not. Because we are the creatures who build vessels to leave our world, who fail, who grieve, who try again. And this is not a weakness or a folly, but rather the most remarkable thing about us. This persistent reaching toward what lies beyond our grasp. This refusal to accept that the boundaries of our birthplace must also be the boundaries of our existence. The Challenger crew knew the risks they were taking, or at least they knew some portion of those risks, because no one can ever know the full measure of what might go wrong in an endeavor as complex and as novel as human spaceflight. They accepted those risks not because they were unaware of them or indifferent to them, but because they believed that what they were doing mattered, that it was worth doing despite the dangers, that the expansion of human presence into space was a goal worthy of their dedication and, ultimately, their lives. And while it would be presumptuous to say what they would have thought about the memorials that now bear their names, the asteroids and the craters and the scholarships and the schools, it seems safe to suppose that they would have wanted their loss to be part of a story that continued, not a story that ended. The names Scobie, Smith, McAuliffe, Jarvis, McNair, Onizuka, and Resnick are now written in stone that orbits the Sun forever. And this is true in the most literal sense, ends. Because the asteroids that bear these names are made of stone and metal, and they will continue their orbits for billions of years, long after our civilization has become whatever it will become, long after the events of January 1986 have faded into the same deep past that now contains the building of the pyramids and the extinction of the dinosaurs and the formation of the Earth itself. We cannot know whether any future beings will ever encounter these small worlds or learn the names we gave them. But we can know that those names are there, carried through the darkness by the same gravitational forces that keep the planets in their courses and the galaxies in their slow rotations. And so, as this gentle narration draws toward its close, let us simply rest for a moment in that thought. The thought of 7 small rocks drifting through the solar system, each one named for a person who once lived and dreamed and hoped, each one a tiny monument to the human capacity for exploration and the human experience of loss. They are out there now, in the cold and the silence, and they will be out there tomorrow and the day after and for all the days that any of us will ever see. They ask nothing of us. These distant memorials, they require no maintenance and no attention, and yet they are there, quietly testifying to the fact that we once sent 7 people toward the stars and that we remembered them when they did not return. This is what we do. We fragile and persistent creatures. We build and we lose and we remember. And then, when we are ready, we build again.